Today, we're going to show you how to reassemble your Garmin Force Trolling Motor. If you're uncomfortable with performing any of the service work yourself, please visit www.garmin.com/dealers to find a certified installer. When reassembling your Garmin Force Trolling Motor, you will need the shaft and motor hardware service kit. Replace any parts with what comes in the service kit, otherwise use the existing hardware that you saved when disassembling. First, take the transducer and run its cable through the nose cone. Using a 3mm hex bit or wrench, secure the transducer to the nose cone using the 6 screws and bushings. Next, we will reinstall the propeller drive motor to the shaft. The screws, replacement seals, and grease packet are included in the motor hardware service kit. Place the 25mm O-ring on the recessed nut from the shaft and motor hardware service kit. With the O-ring facing the transducer, feed the transducer cable through the recessed nut and the hole in the front of the shaft base, but do not feed it up through the shaft. After you have fed all but approximately 2 feet of the transducer cable through the hole in the shaft base, feed the transducer cable up through the shaft. Using compressed air, blow out any dirt or debris in the 4 threaded holes on the top of the propeller drive motor. Now, remove the large 78mm O-ring on the shaft base and discard it. Using the packet included in the shaft and motor hardware service kit, apply grease to the new 78mm O-ring. Then, place the O-ring in the groove on the shaft base. Apply a medium-strength thread locking compound such as Loctite 243 to the threads in the 4 threaded holes on the top of the propeller drive motor. A thread locking compound is required in these holes to ensure a tight connection between the shaft base and the propeller drive motor. Now, remove and discard the 36mm O-ring from the top of the propeller drive motor. Then, thread the cables through the new O-ring. Using the packet in the shaft and motor hardware service kit, apply grease to the new 36mm O-ring and place it in the groove on top of the propeller drive motor. If the power and data cables from the propeller drive motor are not already aligned and bundled straight, align and bundle them with tape. If these cables are not straight and aligned, they may not feed through the shaft smoothly. Next, feed the power and data cables from the propeller drive motor up through the shaft. Gently pull the ends of the power and data cables as you feed them the rest of the way through the shaft. When feeding these cables, be sure to not pull on the connectors, as they are fragile and may break if pulled on. Next, prepare the 4 bolts in the shaft and motor hardware service kit by placing a washer and a 4.75mm O-ring on each one. Again, apply grease on the bolts. Avoid getting grease on the bolt threads. Using a ball head 4mm hex bit or wrench, thread all 4 of the prepared bolts approximately halfway to make sure that the shaft base and propeller drive motor are properly aligned. Using a torque wrench, tighten all 4 bolts to 35 foot-pounds per inch. Now we will install the nose cone and skeg. First, select the correct cable gland from the shaft and motor hardware service kit. For a 4-pin transducer, select the gland with the smaller hole. For an 8 to 12-pin transducer, select the gland with the larger hole. Then, pull the transducer cable straight and measure 15 inches from where the cable enters the transducer. Mark this location with a permanent marker. Next, using the packet in the shaft and motor hardware service kit, apply grease completely to all surfaces of the cable gland. Place the gland on the transducer cable at the marked location. Keeping the cable gland aligned with the mark on the transducer cable, gently pull the excess cable through the top of the shaft until the cable gland fits into the hole on the shaft base. Then, apply grease to the 25mm O-ring on the recessed nut on the transducer cable. Place the recessed nut into the hole on the shaft base, and tighten it using the included tool. Tighten the recessed nut until it stops, and then loosen it 1/14 of a turn. Next, route the transducer cable through the nose cone so that it will fit correctly onto the propeller drive motor. Make sure that the cable is fully in the channel, as it can damage the cable or prevent a tight seal of the nose cone to the propeller drive motor. Then, place the nose cone on the propeller drive motor. Using a 4mm hex bit or wrench, secure the front of the nose cone to the propeller drive motor using the 2 existing screws. Then, using a 3mm hex bit or wrench, secure the bottom of the nose cone to the propeller drive motor using the existing screw. Finally, using a 4mm hex bit or wrench, secure the skeg to the bottom of the propeller drive motor using the existing 4 screws. Next, we will reinstall the shaft to the steering servo housing. First, feed the cables up through the steering servo housing. Insert the shaft into the bottom of the steering servo housing and push it up through the top. The shaft is keyed and will only fit in the housing one way. This process may be easier if you move the motor mount up about halfway. Once the shaft is inserted, tighten the depth adjustment collar on the base of the steering servo housing to lock the shaft in place. Using the coil count that you recorded when you removed the shaft cap, wrap the coil cable around the shaft the same number of times. Then, pull the power and data cables from the shaft completely through the shaft cap. Next, place the shaft cap on the shaft, aligning the coil cable extending from the shaft cap with the groove on the shaft. Using a 4mm hex bit or wrench, install the bolt and nut to secure the shaft cap to the shaft. Now, take the transducer cable and feed it completely through the square hole in the shaft. Then, install the grommet on the transducer cable. The grommet is split on one side for easier installation. Push the grommet into the shaft cap. In the shaft cap, align the rings of the cables by color. Stack the black cables together, making sure that the flat side of the connectors are touching. Place the stacked cables over the standouts in the shaft cap. Using a number 3 Phillips screwdriver, install the screw and lock washer to secure the cables. Repeat this process with the red cables. Then, align both sections of the data cable connector and push together to connect them. Now, take the shaft cap lid and place it on the shaft cap. Using a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, install the 4 screws to secure the lid of the shaft cap. Now, route the transducer cable along the coil cable, using the cable clamps to hold the cables together. Route the transducer cable through the mount base. Then, route the power cable through the mount base. Use the cable clamps to secure the cables to the base. Finally, if you have a power plug, reinstall the plug and connect the motor to power. And that's it! You now have successfully rebuilt your Garmin Force Trolling Motor. For more help, please visit support.garmin.com. Thanks for watching.